my heart would start racing, my pulse would start pounding. I knew that they were panic attacks. I could hear my pulse in my head, boom, 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 boom. And my body would not obey what I wanted it to do. Like, I would want to be like, slow down, just breathe. And no, Rainn, just slow down and breathe. It's like my body was fighting my brain. So I was starting to drink, I was starting to smoke pot, I started to dabble in coke, and I remember one time specifically.
Hi there, my name's Rainn Wilson, but as many of you know me as Dwight Schrute from NBC's The Office.
No matter who you are, no matter what you do, the temptation is the struggle with the self, with the ego. I was the very first person to audition for The Office, and then became world famous all in like a span of a year. I spent so much time unhappy and dissatisfied while doing the greatest job I will ever have. I was in a struggle, like, I'm getting tons of money. Why aren't I getting more? I'm really famous now. Why am I not more famous? Just that ravenous, like, I want more, more, more. It's a very human impulse. We all think we'd be immune to that, but we all have our struggles. This idea of a spiritual revolution comes from my personal story, from the struggles that I've had, the suffering that I've had. I had some very, very dark thoughts. I didn't know what to do with these feelings of despair and anguish and anxiety, but I thought that they were going to kill me, so the only thing I knew to do was...
Today we have the honor of sitting down with Rainn Wilson. Rainn rose to prominence as one of the main stars of The Office, and his character Dwight became one of the most iconic in television history. The Office ranks atop nearly every list for one of the best TV shows of all time. But there is so much more to Rainn than his acting career. He co-founded the media company SoulPancake in 2008, which explored life's biggest questions. And he's also known as one of the most outspoken advocates for spirituality in Hollywood. In 2015, he published his autobiography, The Bassoon King, and in 2023 released SoulBoom, an instant New York Times bestseller. The idea behind SoulBoom is that the Western world is in desperate need of a spiritual revolution, and today we're diving deeper into that. In this episode, Rainn shares his personal journey from battling addiction, anxiety attacks, and an existential crisis, to finding healing through therapy and spirituality. We also explore how he landed the role on The Office and how his Hollywood career took off. From the myth that success leads to happiness to the role of spirituality in mental health, we unpack big questions about consciousness, religion, and human suffering. This conversation is Rainn at his most vulnerable, with raw and rich insights. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, N2 Water. At Mighty Pursuit, we're all about holistic well-being, mind, body, and spirit. And when it comes to the body, proper nutrition is key. In today's world of ultra-processed foods, getting the right nutrients can be a challenge. That's where N2 Water comes in. It's a hydration powder packed with essential minerals, especially calcium and magnesium, sourced from mineral-rich seaweed off the coastal waters of Iceland. These nutrients are crucial for overall health, supporting everything from muscle and nerve function to heart health. What I love most, it actually tastes great. My go-to is lemonade, but they also offer grapefruit, margarita, and peach lemonade. Just add a stick pack to your daily water bottle and enjoy the benefits. We only partner with brands we believe in, and that's why we're excited to share this with you. Get 20% off at n-2water.com/mightypursuit using the code EARLYSIPS at checkout. You'll find the link in the description and show notes. Now let's get back to the show. So I wanted to start by traveling a bit back into time, when you're about to graduate from NYU in the late 80s. So you get accepted into the acting program, spend a few years there, and all culminates in what is called the League Showcase at Juilliard. And I think in your memoir, you called this one of the most nerve-wracking events you've ever been a part of. So you can explain what happened that night?
Yeah, so I graduated from the graduate acting program at NYU after 3 years of intensive training. And back in the day, I don't know if they still do it exactly this way, but Juilliard, Yale, and NYU, which were considered like the top 3 acting training programs, would do a presentation for every producer, casting director, theater owner, whatever you could think of in New York. They would all assemble at this theater at Juilliard, like 500 of the most influential people in acting, but TV casting and whatnot. And they would watch a showcase where you would do 2-minute scenes that you had been working on for months. The problem with this was, well, first of all, I sucked and I was not good. And I didn't get any calls. No one, 500 people there, there's all these different boxes they can check. They can say like, come in and schedule a meeting with me, check. Send in your picture and resume, check. Like, meet me for lunch, check, like in levels of intensity. And I didn't get a single request from anyone of 500 people there. So I was literally, I think I was the only person in my class that did not get a single request to move to some kind of next level with some kind of person in the industry. I was devastated, absolutely devastated. In a way, I was kind of fucked. Fortunately, I then got into Shakespeare in the Park as an understudy, non-equity understudy. I actually understudied the actor Fisher Stevens, if you know him, in Twelfth Night in the Park. And then I was able, through contacts, to get in this kind of touring Shakespeare company called the Acting Company. So I was able to kind of get some work, especially in Shakespeare, getting out of school. So I was very fortunate. I didn't have any agent or manager or interest in me whatsoever. So it started at the very, very bottom.
Yeah.
In fact, my first paid role as an actor was for over a year. I played in the play Romeo and Juliet. You've heard of the play.
Yeah.
Well, I played the role of Peter. Think back in your mind, who the hell is Peter?
Yeah.
The nurse's assistant. I had like 7 lines.
Yeah.
And so, I started at the very bottom, but absolutely devastating experience. And, one I guess I'm super grateful for, and I've had so much rejection over the course of my career as an actor. I've been rejected by dozens of talent agencies and managers, from jobs. I was told I would never work in television. I was told I would never get commercials because I was too weird looking. Just over and over and over again. The funny thing about that was that one of the reasons that the scenes sucked is because I had just been playing Hamlet at NYU.
Which it seemed like from your memoir, it seemed like you did a good job.
I think I did a pretty good job. It was hard as hell. I went through a lot with it. The first director that was on it was fired. It was a lot of work. It was so challenging, but I did a pretty good job. So here I am playing Hamlet in a 2.5 hour production and kicking ass, but my 2-minute scenes that the 500 people were watching, they're like, who's that? Essentially, it's like, I have no interest in that weird looking guy, but he's not weird looking enough to be like a successful character actor. Like if I weighed 300 pounds, it'd probably be like, I could see him on a sitcom or whatever. So that's, it's just part of the journey that when you're in the midst of it is chaotic. It's like you're a pachinko ball bouncing around in your life, and there seems to be no rhyme or reason. But I forget if maybe it's Kierkegaard who said that life makes sense looking back on it.
Retroactively.
Only in retrospect.
Yeah. I mean, when I read your memoir, that night, that period just really stuck out to me. Obviously, you wrote SoulBoom 2 years ago, was published, but 10 years ago you had your memoir, and just it seemed like the effect that had on you of like not like being selected, and you were just in Hamlet and thought you were going to be selected, and then you're at the school. I mean, Juilliard is basically that school is basically at the Harvard of acting, and so you're on the stage and then you don't get selected, and then it seemed like there was like this downward spiral spurring from like the rejection. Like, do you remember like at that time, why did the rejection feel so like impact you so much that you like weren't selected?
Well, listen, rejection hurts anyone. My son was just dating someone and then got rejected and is devastated, by one person, right? You're rejected by 500 people. You've spent 3 years training for a career and no one wants you. they're not even remotely interested in you. They don't even want to see your picture and headshot on their desk. Like, it's years of your life leading to this point. And it's brutal, but you know what? It's a brutal business. You know, it's like, what's his name? I always forget his name. The accountant in The Godfather Part 2 is like, this is the business we have chosen, you know? And if you don't want some rejection, and if you don't want to kind of like get your face slammed in a pile of dog shit, then don't sign up to be an actor, because I could have gone to accounting school, right? So sometimes actors love to commiserate about their struggles in their career and the difficulties and the unfairness of the career, and I get it, and I do the same thing, but there's a little bit of me of like, this is what you signed up for. No one said it was going to be fair, and that the best talent was going to rise, and that people were going to treat you with justness and compassion and wisdom. Like, that's showbiz, folks. But I think for me too, like, very low self-esteem. You know, this nerdy, fragile, vulnerable kid from suburban Seattle who moved to the big city to go to acting school at age 20. And I just wanted people to like me. And, you know, that's part of at the root of almost every actor. I know a few that don't operate with this modus operandi, but kind of, I hope you like me, you know, and like, I'll get on stage and what if I did this? Does that make you laugh? Does that make you interested? There's an element about that to every actor. Hopefully you get over that, and then you work harder on creating character and telling story and using language and harnessing your emotions. But I hope you know, Sally Field getting her Oscar, you like me, you really like me. There is an element of that to every actor. So when 500 people are like, we don't like you, you know, it's like
devastating. Yeah. I mean, you've been pretty open about, like, at that period of life, drug addiction, stuff like that. In your memoir, you talked about how that was like the first night you had tried cocaine. And so was that just kind of at that point, because of the drug addiction, like par for the course, or was that experience kind of being rejected the thing that was like the catalyst to you trying that?
Well, no, it wasn't really a catalyst. I grew up, and I know you're going to get to this, but I grew up a member of the Baha'i faith. So I was a very sober young man. Baha'is don't drink or, you know, gamble or do drugs or supposedly have premarital sex while growing up. And I was kind of a good little Baha'i kid for the most part. But that started to really unravel at around age 21. We're talking like 23 right now. So I started dabbling in all of that stuff, you know, kind of like an Amish kid on Rumspringa. You know, I became increasingly alienated with my faith, with God, with religion, and certainly with morality. I was living in the village in New York City, and no one gave a shit about morality, and I didn't want to. And so I was starting to drink. I was starting to smoke pot. I started to dabble in coke, and I wanted to live the bohemian lifestyle. I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be cool. I wanted to be at the downtown bars and hang out at, you know, CBGB and the clubs and rock and roll and punk. And so there was also a lot of anxiety and depression that had manifested before this rejection and after this rejection. Putting this event aside, here I am, I'm 23. I'm dirt broke. I don't have any money for rent, so I'm living in an abandoned beer brewery in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and waiting tables till 4 a.m. at like the seediest scuzzy bar, literally on the Bowery. getting paid off the books in cash. I had like wads of like cash stuck in like coat pockets because I didn't really know what to do with it. And I didn't want to pay taxes on it. And, you know, I was dabbling in drugs and alcohol at the time. And like, what the fuck do I do now? I don't have an agent. I don't, you know, seem to have a career ahead of me. I did get those jobs eventually, but it was a really devastating time. I had some very, very dark thoughts. So I started going to therapy, and, you know, therapy's a crapshoot because guess what? There are good therapists and there are bad therapists. There are good podcast hosts and there are bad podcast hosts. There are good actors and bad ones. There are good car mechanics and bad ones. So people sometimes will be like, I tried therapy and it sucked, and so I'm never going back. It's like, well, it's not a catch-all. Like, you have to find the person. But I had a really terrible therapist, and I went to this therapist, and I was able to go to like, I think you had to pay like $10 as like a copay. And it lasted for a year after NYU, and it was at Bellevue Hospital. I literally went into Bellevue Hospital, like with the people screaming from being straitjacketed. I'm not even kidding. These were some dark days. 1989, New York City. It was cold. And I said, I think I'm really depressed. I can't get out of bed. I'm having anxiety attacks. I don't know what to do with my life. I have no purpose, no hope. I think I'm really depressed. And she was like, no, you're not.
She just said, no, you're not?
She said, no, you're not. You're not. I don't think you're depressed.
It's quite a way.
I don't think you have depression.
Putting it.
So I was just like, oh, okay. It's like, you know, I don't know if I didn't fit the like clinical definition of, you know, having diagnosed depression or something. I don't know what the hell, but that was not terribly helpful. So my tiptoeing down into using drugs and alcohol really was a way of medicating anxiety and depression when I look back on it. I wasn't the kind of drug addict that was in the gutter with a needle in my arm. I wasn't the kind of drunk that was passing out in his own vomit night after night. But it was long-term usage of substances to try and essentially to quell anxiety and detach me from feeling my feelings, which were very intense and mostly negative.
You had that experience with the negative experience with therapists. I assume that you probably ended up getting paired up with a good therapist at that point, or? No,
not until I moved to LA and I started therapy again in like 2001, 2002, right around then, and found some good therapy.
Okay, so your experience, like first time you did that, late 80s, early 90s, bad experience with therapy. Were there any realizations that you were having at that time period with the, you had the stuff with the drugs, but, you mentioned the anxiety. Like, was there like a epiphany that you had about why you had anxiety or that was something that came later on in life as well?
Well, listen, I've unpacked this a lot in therapy. My mom left me and my dad when I was about a year and a half. And I saw her maybe a handful of times, briefly for like a day or half a day or a lunch or an ice cream cone before I was 13, 14 years old. So that'll mess you up, right? Right when you're in the center of like mommy attachment mode as a toddler, to have that's just gone. You just don't see her. Then my dad got remarried to my stepmom, and they had a really unhappy marriage. And so then I grew up in a house that was really loveless. And like I mentioned, we were members of the Baha'i faith, and Baha'i faith is all about love and unity and singing songs and together, and we're going to eliminate prejudice and make the world a better place, and yay. And, it's very idealistic and big-hearted, which is great. But then you'd come home to parents that not only were not in love, not hugging, not even like talking to each other. So that'll also fuck you up. So it's a perfect petri dish for addiction and anxiety. I know where that comes from. And probably I'm just wired for anxiety anyway. I'm just a generally anxious guy. That has nothing to do with childhood trauma. I just am anxious. We're all a little anxious. I think I'm a little extra special anxious. So, you know, the journey in the 90s that I thank you for doing your research and reading my books and whatnot. I really appreciate that. And I write about it in the Bassoon King was I didn't know what to do with these feelings of despair and anguish and anxiety. I literally did not know what to do, but I thought that they were going to kill me or at least render my life unlivable in some way. So the only thing I knew to do back then, because there were not self-help books, there were not podcasts, there were not apps, no one was meditating, you know, therapy was a very rare thing. It was in Bellevue Hospital.
Stigmatized, yeah.
And stigmatized and hard to get to and in this, you know, Victorian building with people screaming in the balcony. The only thing I knew to do from my Baha'i background was to look at spiritual solutions for mental health problems. I thought, well, maybe I've jettisoned God, I've jettisoned the Baha'i faith and its founder, teacher, prophet Baha'u'llah. I've jettisoned the faith of my parents. I don't have morality in my life. I don't have kind of prayer or meditation. Maybe I can find a solution to my anguish through researching and digging deeper into possible spiritual solutions.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the anxiety attacks that you described in your memoir, I mean, I very much related to. I mean, I've had panic attacks before and just very acute moments in 2019, I remember really negative place emotionally. And we were living in Seattle at that point, looking for a new apartment. And I couldn't even stay with it when we were with the kind of realtor who was showing us around this apartment building. And I just sat and I collapsed on the floor and this feeling of your hands tingling and you're sweating and literally, you know, feels like there's a demon in your head or something like that. It's just everything, it's literally being a living hell. And so did you relate to that? What did that feel like for you when you were having an anxiety attack?
Yeah, I got them periodically for about 5 years, off and on. There was about 2 years that they were pretty bad, and then a few years where they would come and I kind of knew what they were and how to deal with them. For some reason, and I forget how, I knew that I wasn't having a heart attack and I knew I wasn't having a nervous breakdown. I knew that they were panic attacks I don't know if I'd read an article or researched it or something, but I knew that's what was going on. But my heart would start racing. My pulse would start pounding. I could hear my pulse in my head, goong, 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 goong. And my body would not obey what I wanted it to do autonomically. I would want to be slow down, just breathe. And no, Rainn, just slow down and breathe. It's like my body was fighting my brain. My consciousness and my autonomic responses were at odds. They were battling. And there were many times, I remember one time specifically living in this abandoned beer brewery with my friend John in Brooklyn, lying on the floor, and I was watching sweat go and drip, and I was just huddled like this, do I call an ambulance? You know, do I have John call an ambulance? And just my heart, you know, racing. And but it's not just the anxiety. And then I remember it was something I read, focus on the exhale or something like that. So I'd just focus on, because if you focus on the inhale, you'll actually hyperventilate and you can kind of pass out. But it felt like 25 minutes. It was probably 4 minutes. But it's not just that. It's for 2 days afterwards, you don't feel the same.
Yeah.
It's almost like you've had an epileptic fit or something like that. I just was unsettled, unsure. Is it going to come back? dare I walk to the pizza parlor because I could have one in the pizza parlor? What if that happens? So I could have one in the pizza parlor, have one walking while there, and then no one's around. Before cell phones, so we didn't have an ability to like, am I going to be able to go on the subway? I would get them on the subway a lot. Like when subways would like stop underground and go silent and go, that engine's traw.
Yeah.
Then it would trigger it for me. That was like a trigger, even though I'm not that claustrophobic necessarily. So, but it was that was a symptom of a larger thing going on. I think that's a surface symptom of a much larger dysregulation that's happening inside, where you're unmoored and disconnected from your heart, mind, spirit, breath, consciousness.
Yeah, I totally relate with that. I mean, I feel like I got in a state where it was like I would have the panic attack, but then the thoughts and the intrusive thoughts of like it was so bad that it was like, what if it comes back? So it's like you're not really restoring to a healthy baseline. You're restoring to kind of like an anxious baseline.
That's very well put.
And then I would then induce like another one because I was in an anxious thing, and it would just be this like pattern of going like in and out of these panic attacks. And you mentioned the spiritual tools, but I feel like people only have the tools available to them that they're aware of. And I love a lot of the work that you're doing with SoulBoom, but the more integrative approach with mental health and spirituality and all these different ideas that converge. But at that time, like you were saying, like you only really had the knowledge to pursue spiritual ideas. I think it's interesting what you were mentioning about the Baha'i faith, because a lot of people can relate to that, of being turned off by religion because of essentially hypocrisy, of like something that's supposed to be preaching love, and it's just like it puts such a bad faith in your mouth. I mean, taste in your mouth,
and a bad faith in your mouth.
Yeah. And so, I mean, yeah, you talked about basically having this phase of being an atheist, but if you could describe a little bit more about like the climate in your household, like growing up, that kind of contributed to these festering feelings and the mental health, like what would you say about that?
Yeah, I just think that my dad suffered. He passed away about 4 or 5 years ago now. God rest his soul. He's a beautiful man, and we had mostly a really positive relationship. But he was really traumatized as a kid. So he was not able to be an emotional caretaker for a child, or grow a child and raise a child. And he has like a Charles Dickens child. Like my childhood is nothing compared to his. I mean, he was just beaten, and Dad would take off, and they had empty cupboards and no food. He'd have to go ask for food from the neighbors, and they didn't have heat, and they'd wear like 3 coats, and like it was like as bad as you can imagine. And so he was not able to nurture someone else. He was pretty emotionally disconnected. And then, my stepmom, Kristen, I don't know about her childhood trauma, but she also did not have the tools to really nurture. In some ways, nurture, like making a meal, having, mac and cheese and broccolini available at the end of the day, which she was able to do, and vacuum the carpets and help me do homework and stuff. So there were all the trappings of a lovely lower middle class Seattle upbringing. We lived in a tiny 900 square foot concrete rental house with a shitty little yard in the suburbs. And my dad worked managing a sewer repair office, and she was a homemaker. And but she was not terribly emotionally nurturing, and often would rage. And because I asked them when I was writing the Bassoon King, hey, when did you know that your marriage was not a good idea? And they were both like, it was like within 6 months of them getting married. And they stayed married for 15 years they stayed married, but they knew within 6 months it was not a good idea. And you can just feel that. You know what it's like to go in a room where people are pretending there's love, but there's not really
totally.
love. And it's hollow. So, yes, I had meals and I had a roof over my head, and, I was driven to swim lessons and to Cub Scouts and stuff like that. But what I really wanted was a hug. What I really wanted was just like an embrace of like, Rainn, you're beautiful and special, and we adore you, and you're doing great. You're doing just fine. We all want, that's what we want. We don't want iPhones and Xboxes and, a lot of busyness. We just want that connection. And I didn't get that. So, that haunted me for a long time. And at the same time, I'm super, for all this stuff, the rejection, the trauma, the difficulty, the addiction, I'm so grateful for it. Because I get to speak to you about it now. I get to share it with young people. I go to colleges sometimes and do talks about mental health. I get to write about it. My next book is going to be on the meaning of life. Little topic. Like
small.
And I don't have the meaning of life. Of course, I don't know what the meaning of life is, but I have a few inklings, and having suffered a little bit and struggled and bumped my head a few times, it gives me a better indication of, I know what's not the meaning of life. So that's a good starting point.
Yeah. I mean, where you're at now, I mean, you're speaking with these realizations, and I would call it even more a reflective, evolved view, because in the moment, the acuteness of how someone might feel towards their parents, whether it was just not a great household experience, or at worst, it was just abusive or something like that. One of our guests that we've had on is kind of one of the leading trauma experts like in the country. And what's unique about him is he worked at Harvard. And so he's seen clients for 30 years, but he also had this experience of being traumatized with his father, physically abusive, all of that stuff. And he had said a similar thing at the end of like, the end point of this full circle is when you can see that like every person that has done something to you, like something was done to them. Yeah. And so like being able to recognize that, I think in some ways, it doesn't take away from what they did. And that still is like traumatic, but recognizing that kind of puts us all on this like level playing field of like, we're all perpetuating the trauma. We're all perpetuating.
And that's one of our main jobs. One of our main jobs as human beings is to recognize that there has been generational trauma that's perpetrated forward, and that some of that has been perpetrated on us. Now, my dad was a hell of a lot better to me than his dad was to him. His dad was downright abusive. My dad wasn't abusive, but just cut off and disconnected. Okay, I'll take that over abuse any day. And our job is to stop the cycle, to break the cycle. My job in raising my son, Walter, was to be present, loving, and to give him exactly what I, exhorted to you that I needed: to be held, looked in the eyes, told, you mean something. You're doing great. I've got your back. I'm here for you. You are lovable. You are inherently interesting and divine and something special. And I get to do that in a way. And then hopefully he can carry that forward. So it is part of our responsibility to heal, generation after generation.
Yeah. When you were in the moment, obviously in your early 20s, it seemed like when I was reading your memoir, it was a bit of like a spiritually rebellious phase, if that language resonates with you. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, you would have, when you're going through all this stuff, would you have considered yourself an atheist, or what have you said about that?
Yeah, I realized after about a year of being in New York, trying to maybe engage with the Baha'i community there, I was just like, fuck this. I'm just done. My faith tradition held such a big took up so much air in the room when I was a kid. And again, there was so much I loved about that and I loved about it. But at that point in my life, I was like, mostly, well, to a large extent, because I was having sex with my girlfriend, and Baha'is aren't supposed to have premarital sex. And no one had talked to me about like, hey, how does morality work? Like, what do you do when you fall short? You know, you may have some goals and then you're not able to meet those goals from a moralistic standpoint. Like, how does that work? Is God all forgiving or not? Or is God judgmental and going like, you're masturbating, asshole. Oh, you're going to pay. Like, is that really how God works? Really? God would have to be a dick to work that way. Like, how does grace work? How does struggle work? What is sin exactly? Like, these are really important topics. People don't really like to get into them very much, but they're really important topics. But no one had massaged those with me. So I just felt guilty as hell, but I wasn't going to stop having sex with my girlfriend. I was 20. I was living in New York City. You know, we were living together. I mean, come on, give me a break. So that was the first straw. But then I just saw hypocrisies, and then I was rebelling against my parents, and this was the religion of my parents. So I was like, screw that. And yeah, I really was at the time like, I don't know if there's a God. I wouldn't say I am convinced there is no God. And unless I see a certain algorithm on a certain laboratory that proves that there's a God, then I'm going to believe in God. But it wasn't like that kind of thing. But it's like, I don't even know that there is a God. Probably not. I don't know. Look at all of the death and hypocrisy and war and division caused by people who believe in God. Screw that. So it was not it was not an Alex O'Connor informed decision about atheism. It was kind of like, fuck all y'all, you know?
The way you relate to people about that in SoulBoom is honestly quite remarkable. I mean, there's this whole chapter and, you know, the Sky Daddy like analogy and the Santa Claus analogy. And I feel like a lot of people have gone through that process. And so were you just like wrestling at that point of like, you know, there must be a God, maybe there's a God, but like it can't be this. It can't be like this like Sky Daddy depiction in the sky of what we've been handed.
Yeah, it is one of the events of my life that I am the most sincerely grateful for. Was for some reason, during this difficulty and anguish, and a cut to me being like 24, 25 now, I was kind of like, you know, I kind of did the fuck all y'all to God and my parents and my faith. And then I was like, there's probably not a God. Religion sucks. My parents suck. There's hypocrisy everywhere. It's a Holden Caulfield, essentially. And then I kind of was like, all right, let's start from the very basics. Like because I was so unhappy, and again, this is a driver, right? So many people that get help in 12-step programs have to hit bottom first in order to get the kind of help that they need, where they just throw up the white flag and like, I've tried it every other way. White flag. I'll do whatever you tell me. I give up. I'm powerless. And in that powerlessness, there emerges some real strength and wisdom that coming out of the phoenix from the ashes. Redemption. I was lost, now I'm found. But because I was in anguish, I thought there might be a spiritual solution, and I had jettisoned spirituality. I thought there might be a spiritual solution to my unhappiness. And the place where I started was with God, because I was like, I have to know there's a God or know that there's not a God in order to proceed with this. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that drives me crazy is people are like, I'll check in with someone and we'll have lunch, and they'll be like, yeah, I just don't know if I believe in God. And I really have problems with God, and I struggle with God, and I just don't know. And you're like, cool. Okay, great. Then flash forward, you see him 10 years later, 15 years later, you have lunch, like, yeah, I just don't know if there's a God. I'm struggle with God, and I really don't know. It's like, God damn it, you haven't done the work. Like, do the work. Like, you can figure this out. And I guarantee you could come out on the other side with a little bit more clarity than being this kind of like helpless victim state of like, oh gosh, I don't know, oh God, where you're just like a tadpole on a lily pad flashing around. Like, you read books about it, listen to podcasts about it, go on a spirit search in the desert, like go to a meditation retreat, like visit the Pope. Like there's things you can do to kind of rectify this. You don't have to be a helpless victim. So I don't know what it was in me. Maybe it's genetic, maybe it's my personality, maybe it's the way my parents raised me, but I was like, God damn it, I'm going to figure this out. And I really cleared a lot of rooms because I would have conversations with people and sit down, have a coffee or meet someone at a party and be like, do you believe in God? And, 9 out of 10 people would be like, and, want to run away, especially in New York City. And a lot of people were like, well, a lot of my friends were like, well, I know there's not nothing, but I also don't know. I have a real hard time with the concept of God. Really struggle with it. There's something, but I just don't know. And that's what I heard over and over again. There's something out there, but I just don't know. It's like, well, fucking figure it out.
Yeah.
Read physics, take a class, get a theology degree. Like, there's about 1,000 books you can read. Go read The Seventh Story Mountain. Go read Aquinas. Like, there's so much you can do. Go visit every church within 10 miles of your house. But I think people are just ultimately lazy about it. So I read a lot of books and I started reading all the central religious books of all the world's religions on this quest for deciding if there was a God or not. It's like, I tell the lame joke. It's like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. There either is a God or there's not. That's it.
I love that. I feel like it's the biggest question. I mean, but it's kind of like the ground zero question, because it's like you kind of build from that place. You build your entire life of like, what is the meaning of life? What's the purpose? And I think a lot of these ideas people are already thinking about unconsciously. I think when we seek success or happiness or beauty or all these things, it's like we're grasping at these ideas without fully addressing this question that you're talking about. And I found this, so you're at this moment of like spiritual rebellion. Now you're becoming more open. And the moment that really struck me in your journey was, so for people that are not familiar, the Native American, I guess, term for God is the Great Mystery. And so like you're at...
In the Lakota Sioux tradition, one of the names of God is Wakantanka, which means the Great Mystery.
Okay, yeah. So you're at a Yankees game, and then you have this...
Close.
Mets?
Yeah, but watching it on TV. We're not at the game.
Okay,
but,
so you're watching
close.
on TV.
You're in the right ballpark.
You have this...
Intended.
You have this prayer that you do. You're with your friend, and can you explain like what happened with that game?
I see my friend Phil Party. He's a poet. Look him up. Brilliant guy. One of my dearest friends. And we were watching the Mets, and they were down by a run in the bottom of the ninth. And I think Darryl Strawberry, like the pitcher, was going up to hit. And as far as I remember, and we had been talking about God, and I had been talking about reading about Wakantanka, because this idea in the Lakota tradition that God is known as the Great Mystery, I was like, as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, wait a second. If God is the Great Mystery, that means he's not male. He's not up on a cloud. He doesn't have a beard. He's not as portrayed in the Sistine Chapel. He's not even as portrayed in the Hebrew Bible, with lots of smoting and smiting. And it's a very, very, very radically different conception of what a higher power is, if you think of it as the Great Mystery. And as an artist, or I like to think of myself as an artist, that really resonated with me. And so I was like, hey, Great Mystery. Ooh, I can kind of get with that. And so we were talking about this idea of the Great Mystery and this God that's in nature, beyond time and space, that's in all of the aspects of nature, it's in our ancestors, is beyond all of that at the same time. And Phil's like, put it to the test. If you believe in Wakantanka, because he's really agnostic leaning towards atheist. Let's put it to the test. So I literally, in his living room, in the door jamb, in Jamaica Plain, in Massachusetts, outside of Boston, I went, "Oh, Wakantanka." I don't know why I lifted up my arms in this way, but this is what I did. I went, "Oh, Wakantanka, great mystery, God." And this was the first time I had prayed in years. Let's say at that point, 5 years, first time I had prayed. "Oh, Wakantanka, if you exist, sorry to ask you this, can you reveal yourself and let Darryl Strawberry hit a home run? Show yourself and let the Mets win." And finished the prayer, looked at the TV. "You're not going to believe it. Oh, he hit a 2-run home run off the back wall and the Mets win in the bottom of the ninth." And we were literally like, it was a literal jaw drop moment. And as I was on that journey at that point, I was really like, we laughed, ha 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 ha. And it was weird. But inside I was like, oh shit. Like, this is kind of serious. Maybe I need to continue with this journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, and then, what happened after that, it seems like there was like an increased tendency to there's this cute moment of like prayer, but like in the years or time that followed and you're on Broadway, it seemed like you started praying more frequently.
Yeah. Slowly but surely, I started to deepen a belief that there was a God. And then the next question is, just to get all philosophical, theological on your ass. It's like, okay, so if you then give your heart to the idea that there is a power greater than us at work in this universe and infinite number of other universes beyond this one, then what does that God want from us? Because that's part 2. You can't just stop at like, okay, there's a God. All right, see you later. Maybe I'll go to church occasionally. Like, what does God want from us if he, she, it, they exists? And that's what I spent several years reading holy books, wondering about, what does that mean? So why is God a great mystery? Why don't we live in a physical universe where God you see God every once in a while. Like you look up there and the face parts the cloud, like in a Monty Python animated cartoon, and the face of God goes, "Hello, how's it going down there?" And like, "Hi, God." And everyone can see him. And that there's some great father up in the sky. And why don't we live in that kind of physical reality? How does this work? Anyway, what does God want from me? So I was able to spend several years assiduously digging into that question. And yeah, while I was digging into that question, there was more and more prayer going on.
Yeah. What I like about that is like, on one hand, it's a pursuit, it's an investigation, it's more of an intellectual thing and trying to make sense of these big questions and philosophical. But then I know one of your guests was Anne Lamott on your podcast, and so she wrote a book and it's very simple. Like the 3 things of prayer is like thanks, help,
thanks, wow,
help, thanks, wow. And so like it's so simple, like in the sense of you could just engage, like whether you're on Broadway and you're praying or whatever, you're auditioning, it's just like, I need help with this or something like that. And so it's a very basic thing, but I think those 2 things together is really an interesting combination for someone.
Yeah, but let me just reframe a little bit about what you're saying.
Yeah.
The journey in some ways was theological and philosophical, but let's not forget that it was fueled by anguish. It was fueled by a deep, deep unhappiness, feeling lost, feeling disconnected, anxiety attacks, addiction, engaging in behaviors that I didn't want to be engaging in. Why is that? Like it might have lived intellectually, but it was fueled by emotion and by heart. And And again, when I look back on it, I'm so grateful for that, because I wasn't like in a philosophy class going like, let's have the teleological discussion about X, Y, and Z. I did engage in that, but it was because I was so fucking miserable and I wanted to feel better. I just wanted to feel better. I just wanted to feel whole. I wanted to feel connected. So what I'm grateful for, that some reason God guided me, or I had my own internal moxie where I was like, I'm going to roll up my sleeves. I'm going to fucking dig into this and see if I can't uncover some kind of truth and wisdom to help me on my journey. And this is I didn't realize it at the time, but when I re-engaged with the Baha'i faith, one of the most important central tenets of the Baha'i faith is the individual investigation of truth. So Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, says that all men have an obligation and responsibility to find truth for themselves. So think about 1,000 years ago, you didn't have the option of finding the truth for yourself, right? If your dad was a Lutheran, then you were a Lutheran. If your dad was a Muslim, then you were a Muslim. If your parents were Hindus, then you were a Hindu and you went to the temple on the corner. You didn't be like 1,000 years ago, like, Hinduism's been fun, but maybe I want to explore Scientology for a while or whatever. That was like, are you fucking kidding me? You just get stoned to death and thrown into a gorge. Like that wasn't a reality. But in this modern time, because Baha'u'llah's message, Baha'is belief, is for the modern world, this is a really important thing to do. So, for my Christian friends who are faltering, struggling, like Rhett and Link, who were recently on the SoulBoom show, and we had wonderful conversations about this stuff, would say, like, you don't have to inherit the faith of your parents, and you don't have to inherit the beliefs of the people you're in college with, because you might go to college and everyone's an atheist, right? But you don't have to take that on. You don't have to take on your parents' faith. You get to read and study and ponder and pray and meditate and journey and find the truth for yourself.
I think the anguish part is really interesting, because it feels like if you were to diagnose like how the world actually works, it's like, it seems to be like when we're desperate or we're at the end of ourselves is then when we sort of have these epiphanies. Might just not even be related to spirituality, but just the bigger questions of life. Oh, what really matters?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm diagnosed with cancer. I have like 2 more years to live. Oh, wait. So I've been missing it my entire life.
Yeah.
And it's like, it feels like if you're comfortable, you're not necessarily inclined to be in that mindset.
Yeah. So the tests and difficulties that come to all of us, and when we're at our last gasp and when we're down on the floor, those can be great opportunities. Out of crisis comes great opportunity for, a phoenix rising from the ashes, for transformation. You might find love, you're heartbroken and like, oh, I'll never let that happen again. If I find the right person to be with, I'm going to give my heart to them. You might make a different career choice. God, I've been being a corporate lawyer for 10 years and having nervous breakdown after nervous breakdown. I know a guy who left being a corporate lawyer and is a therapist, I can't, and he walked away from making $500,000 a year to making 80 grand a year, but is so much happier, but those kind of life choices can be fueled by, desperation and heartbreak and difficulty.
So, I mean, by the time you land the role in like Almost Famous in 2000, where are you at then with your spiritual journey?
I'm still on my spiritual journey. I'm going ever closer to the Baha'i faith. I started really going to some Baha'i meetings and book studies in like 98, 99. I moved to LA 99, 2000, right around then. And I got cast in a couple of movies right away, Almost Famous and Galaxy Quest. And I started tiptoeing into the Baha'i community in Los Angeles, and that was a very big community. The Baha'i faith started in Iran/Persia, so there were a lot of Iranian, Persian Baha'is around the world. Certainly not. If there's like 6 million Baha'is, maybe 500,000 of them are Persian, let's say. So most aren't, but they're sprinkled around the world. And certainly there's a lot in Los Angeles. So it's a very big community, a vital community, a lot going on. So that was exciting. And there was a guy I'm still good friends with, Mark Bamford, and he had these, him and his wife, Suzanne, had these beautiful gatherings of people of all different faiths, reading holy writings, a little bit of prayer and meditation, and just discussion around spiritual ideas, deeper spiritual conversations. And they had a lot of artists would come through and people who were just traveling and coming through town. And so every week I went to this spiritual conversation group. And that's when I said, I started getting back into, I went back into therapy, had still going through some really hard times, and started getting involved in 12 steps programs. And that was kind of further along my journey of kind of figuring out what I'm about.
So, I mean, people would naturally be interested in as this journey progresses. Obviously, you're in a different place than you were 10 years prior. You mentioned the therapy thing, you mentioned the spiritual journey. People would naturally be interested in how you landed the office role of Dwight. And so I mean, after reading your memoir, I thought that story behind that was really fascinating. So how did that process all come together while you're living out in
which part of the story? Can I just ask? Because I'm not sure.
Well, I think the audition process,
yeah.
And then the second thing would be I think a lot of people don't know that the show was teetering on is this going to be canceled or is this not going to be canceled?
Yeah.
Those two aspects, you auditioning and then that piece.
Yeah. So a bunch of things happened. Again, life as seen in the rearview mirror makes a lot of sense in a very strange way. Maybe that's just how our brains are wired. But I was lucky enough to land a role on this show called 6 Feet Under that was on HBO. And HBO at the time was incredibly popular and powerful. Sopranos was on, but also Entourage, Sex and the City, The Wire. There were all of these shows that were kind of winning all the awards and getting all this attention. And it was a new way of doing TV. Hey, you pay every month for no commercials and you get all this high quality entertainment that people hadn't really that's weird. I mean, it started in the late 70s and 80s, but it wasn't until around that time that it started to really sink in what HBO was. And that opened a ton of doors. And I had been cast in another TV show with Janeane Garofalo, this comedy that when I look at it was pretty stinky. Janeane's wonderful, lovely, but I ran into this producer at NBC Universal in the parking lot on the way to the table read for this show with Janeane Garofalo. I had my plane ticket, flying the next morning to go to Vancouver, start shooting, be on this other show. And he was like, hey, we got great news. I was like, what? I was like, we got the rights to the BBC version of The Office. We're going to make the American Office. And I was like, oh, that's great. But inside I was like, oh, because I loved the BBC Office. I thought it was so brilliant. And Ricky Gervais was just a genius beyond all measure. And I was kind of stuck on this terrible show with Janeane Garofalo. And I was like, ugh. I was like, great, good luck. And I went to the table read and we read it, so they were going to give the writer some notes before we went up to Vancouver and started shooting. And we read it and it didn't go particularly well, but they don't often go well. Sometimes they don't go well. And then I went home. I was literally packing my suitcase. Bring, bring. Hello. The show's been canceled. They hated the table read so much, they don't want to spend the money on it. Good news, you're still going to get paid. I was like, yes. And I was like, do you think I could audition for The Office? And which wasn't until a couple months later, but I was the very first person to audition for The Office. I still have the call sheet, the casting sheet. In fact, do I still have it? My house got hit in the recent fires.
Yeah.
And I lost a big chunk of my office. And I wonder if I think that survived. I think I saw it in a box down in my garage. I have to dig through these 175 boxes of half-burned stuff and see what's salvageable. But I was the first person to audition, and I auditioned for Dwight and Michael. I did a terrible Michael audition, just doing a Ricky Gervais impersonation. And I did a kick-ass Dwight audition. I was like, just give me the role. I'm like, come on. And they're like, we're going to have callbacks in like 3 months. I'm like, oh, you're kidding me. And then we had a callback thing where we were mixed and matched with other, like 4 or 5 people were being considered for every role. So I remember like reading with Bob Odenkirk, who was auditioning for Michael, you know, and
that's interesting.
Yeah. And I auditioned for, and isn't it great how that worked out? Like Steve Carell got the role he was meant to get, and Bob Odenkirk much later had this amazing career, and he's such a brilliant actor. But I was mixed and matched with different Pams and Jims and doing improvisation and stuff like that over the course of a weekend. And then I was lucky enough to get the show. But again, we had no idea it was going to be successful. It was the time of Friends, and they were all so good looking, and it was all so brightly lit, and it's beautiful apartments and beautiful coffee shops. And here we were shot on like this handheld camera, and we were all weird looking, you know, and poorly lit. And this was a big swing, mockumentary, you know. Spinal Tap and Larry Sanders had been mockumentary, but there hadn't been a lot of mockumentary done.
Kind of pioneering it, yeah.
Yeah, and not on prime time. And we were barely hung on. You know, we did the pilot, and the pilot was okay at best. And we got picked up for 6 more episodes in season 1. That's it, just 6, which is the barest minimum they could possibly do, I think, to try and keep Steve Carell on contract. And then even then they weren't sure, like, it didn't test well, but young people seemed to like it, and they weren't sure. But then Steve Carell had 40-Year-Old Virgin come out, and all of a sudden, he's the same. They were like, they didn't know what they had. They're like, holy shit, we have an A-list movie star on contract for this show. Like, maybe we should continue. And then season 2, you know, even then in season 2, they weren't sure. There was a lot of back and forth, and finally, in a number of different ways, we broke through about a third or a quarter of the way through season 2, and we were off and running. But we just didn't know. We didn't know for the longest time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so fascinating because it's not typically, a lot of times you'll see a TV show take off and it's like just this like instant thing, and The Office ends up becoming basically one of the biggest TV shows of all time, and having those types of beginnings. At what point did you kind of realize like, wow, I'm becoming like a celebrity? Was there like a moment or a series of things that happened that just kind of hit you?
There was a series of things that happened in season 2 where I started getting recognized for it. They put us all on a big billboard in Burbank. Like all of a sudden, that's when we really knew this show was picked up. Like before they even like ordered more episodes, there was a billboard of me, Steve, John, Jenna, BJ, said The Office. It's like, well, they're not going to spend money on a billboard if we're going to get canceled, right?
Yeah.
So seeing my face up there was crazy. And there's a story I've told before, but it just touched me so much. I was going somewhere for some event very early on in the show, and it was the age of flip phones. It wasn't like smartphones. It's 2006. And I was going through the Detroit airport, and this like portly baggage handler was like, hey, buddy. And he's like, oh. And he had his phone and he took it out. I'm like, what's he going to do? Some phones had cameras at that point, but I'm like, does he recognize me? What's going on? It's like, my daughter and I sent text messages of Dwight quotes. Look. And he flips open his phone and it just says, fact, I can and do cut my own hair, on his little flip phone. And then I was like, oh, thanks. And then I was like, all right, we're going to be around for a while. Like if a baggage handler in Detroit is sending quotes around to his daughter, we've made it. That's when you know you've made it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that Hollywood, and TV and film works is like someone like, you hit it big with a TV show, and then it's just kind of like this locomotive train that people start trying to jump on, and can this person become like a big movie? What else can we do with them?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that really hit me was, so you're on this ride of a lifetime with the show. And I feel like your spiritual journey probably really got tested with what happens next. And so I actually think one of the most fascinating parts of your journey is when you land the lead role of like the rocker.
Mm-hmm.
So $14 million budget film. I mean, the supporting cast, Emma Stone, Jason Sudeikis, Bradley Cooper, Aziz Ansari, Christina Applegate. I mean, these are like a lot of like the A-list stars today.
Yeah.
And they were your like supporting cast.
Yeah.
And yet you called that one of the most painful experiences of your life. So can you explain how that all come together and what happened with that film?
Yeah. The Rocker is a film I'm very proud of, and I think it really does hold up, and it has a beautiful, goofy naivete to it that I think if you watched it now, would really kind of make your heart sing. It's about living your dreams, falling in love, stuff like that. It's about youth and finding your path. And, but there were a bunch of things wrong. I think that, I don't think The Rocker is a masterpiece. I think it's a really solid comedy. And we were made by a studio called Fox Atomic, which went belly up the second we wrapped shooting on it. And they changed the release date 5 different times. And then they finally decided to kind of dump it at the end of summer. Like they dumped it at like August 25th, So there's all the big movies opening through the summer. And then like Labor Day and you're getting ready to back to school is not the time to release a film that you believe in. And we came out just weeks after 2 comedy masterpieces, Step Brothers and Tropic Thunder, had both come out in the weeks previous. So we were just dumped and buried, but I had worked so hard on the film. It was my first starring role. It's like my name on the poster, my face on the poster. Like this was my chance to try and make something. So I went around the country promoting it and doing talk shows and whatnot. And it just bombed. I mean, it absolutely bombed. It set it held a record for a while of like the worst performing. It was on like 2,000 screens, and it's like per screen average was like $800 or something. I mean, I think it made $3 million on its opening weekend or something like that, which nowadays seems okay, but back then was like, I mean, it was just, and this is how Hollywood works, is like, oh, he's not a movie star. He can't open a film, he's done. So there's a collective kind of like, who's next? Who can we discover next and put in films, and it was really devastating. It was like being rejected like by the 500 people
at Juilliard.
At Juilliard. In this case, it was like, I'm in a money losing comedy. Yeah, it was so hard. I wept for days. Got really depressed. I was just really overwhelmed. And listen, there's a different perspective. One of the things that I know you wanted to talk about is this kind of spiritual conundrum of, I spent so much time unhappy and dissatisfied while doing the greatest job I will ever have. It's not ever going to get better than The Office. I might do other successful TV shows but none like that. And I get to star in movies. This is the pimply kid from Seattle, from this weird broken home, who got rejected by every agent in New York and was playing Peter in Romeo and Juliet. And then that's in 1990. And then in 2007, 18 years later, I'm starring in movies on on Billboard. I mean, that's fucking great.
Nominated for 3 Emmys.
And can't you just like, Rainn, you dummy, can't you just be like, this is beyond my wildest dreams. Can I just enjoy this? Even if this movie bombs, like, I'll do other movies. It'll be fine, But I was so ambitious and driven and wanted success so bad that I spent a lot of time very unhappy in a certain period of years on The Office. Not the whole time on The Office. I would say the last 5 years of The Office, I was really just loving it. But there was time in there that it was, I was making more money than I ever thought I would make. My wife is amazing. We had a kid. I found my faith. I was on the best TV show on the air at the time, and I was unhappy. Like, go figure.
Yeah, I mean, for the people that are listening that are considering like the spiritual journey piece, I mean, how do you feel like that got tested in that period? Because you had this period before that where, you come into this and you're the investigation of the truth, and then we talked about prayer and like all this stuff. Do you feel like at that time period, becoming famous and being on this TV show, like all of those ideas and all these kind of higher virtues that you like talk about and like SoulBoom, was that all like getting tested? Was that getting thrown to the side? I mean, what was happening there?
Yeah, it's all being tested, I think that I read this article once that was talking about like, what are the biggest stressors that you can undergo in your lifetime? Like, what's the top? And I think number one is like death of a spouse or child. And like number like 2 is coming into a lot of money. And then a number 3 was like having a child. And number 4 is like moving. And like, we had a kid, came into a ton of money, moved, and then became world famous all in like a span of a year. So it was a real test. You don't think of that as a test, and probably people listening are like, I want that test.
Yeah.
I want the comes into a lot of money test, but just look at how miserable people with money mostly are, and lottery winners, tracking lottery winners. It's pretty crazy. So, there was a lot of, framing it in a spiritual perspective. One of the stories I love to tell is that the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, Abdu'l-Baha, he came to the United States a little over 100 years ago. And he was interviewed by a reporter when he landed, and he was going to go on a speaking tour, essentially, and talk about the Baha'i faith and his father, Baha'u'llah, who Baha'is believe is a prophet of God, a manifestation of God for the modern world. And this guy said, hey, do Baha'is believe in Satan? And Abdu'l-Baha was like, yes. No, Baha'is do not have a belief in Satan. Like, we don't believe that there's a demon with red scaly skin who lives in the netherworld and whispers in people's ears and tempts them and runs hell, etc., fallen angel mythology. We don't buy that. But so this is curious. As I was reading the story, they said, well, how do Baha'is view Satan? This reporter asked Abdu'l-Baha, in 1912 or whatever. And he said, Satan is the insistent self. And I just love that story, because no matter who you are, no matter what you do, you can be a midnight security guard at a Walmart. You can be the biggest movie star on the planet. You can be the president. You can be, a multi-billionaire. You can be, a bus driver. It doesn't matter. The temptation, the struggle, of Satan, the greater jihad from Islam is the struggle with the self, with the ego, with the insistent self. And so that's what it was. I was in a struggle, like, I'm getting tons of money. Why aren't I not getting more? I'm really famous now. Why am I not more famous? I'm starring in movies. Why am I not starring in more movies? What, How come I can't get bigger? How come I can't get more? This, it's like the Monty Python sketch where the Mr. Creosote wants just one more wafer thin mint before he explodes. Like just that ravenous, like, oh, more. And it's a very human impulse. We all think we'd be immune to that and that we'd be more grounded, but it was a difficult time.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because it's really this conundrum of like, what is enough in life? And I think the microcosm, like zooming in and of the Emmy wins, and I mean, this just happened with Demi Moore with the Oscars, right? And so it's like you're nominated for like best actor or best actor for a comedy series or something like that, and so you're already at like the heights of what you could possibly achieve successful in TV and film. And then you have these cameras panning in on you and like, oh, we're going to announce the winner for this. And then, you don't win. And so it's like, you're in this tension of like, it kind of should be enough that like you're living your dream role. You were just nominated for this. Does it really matter if I win this? But at the same time, it's like, oh, but if I won that, then I would be a Emmy winner. I wouldn't be a Emmy nominated thing. Yeah. And you get like stuck in this thing because I feel like, the enough conundrum is like it's like this moving target, whether it's like success, whether it's money. It's like when I get to this stage, it's going to be enough. No, okay, wait, no, it's just a little bit more, and it's a little bit more, and it's a little bit more, and it's like this like never ending finish line of that.
Just a story popped into my head, and you probably know it better. I'm sure the listeners know it even better than that. I'm not sure from what tradition it is, but it was some king granted someone who saved his life, like, you can have as much land as you want to ride around in the day, but whatever you can ride around in the day and get back by sunset, you can have all that land. And I don't even know if I'm telling the story right. I remember this from being a kid. It just popped into my head. Like, so they set off and they're like, oh, I like that. And like, oh, I like this mountain. I'm going to ride around that. Oh, I like this stream. I like this and they just keep going and they don't make it back. Because they just want more and more and more, and they don't make it back, so they don't get anything. And that's part of being human, And but we all have our struggles. We all have the insistent self to wrestle with. And again, just enormous gratitude for what a rich, wild, crazy life I've had, and the tests and struggles that I've had, because that's where wisdom comes from. I like to think I'm more wise now, but I still have my struggles. I still have difficulties. So, I'm not immune or arrived. I'm still a crazy, neurotic, anxious fuck up that struggles with my ego. I'd like to think I'm a little better at it.
Yeah, I think the thing that you said about Satan and the self is interesting, and maybe even the idea of our tendency to fixate on the wrong things. And when I looked into your project that you worked on, My Last Days, was just absolutely incredible. So, what can we learn about life from those facing death? And I think, that idea of like enough, or the idea of like what we're fixating on is like really put to the test. Like in that show, like there's these crazy like realizations and what we learned from these people. Can you talk about that project a little bit for people that are not familiar?
Sure. Well, I had a digital media company that I started with some friends called SoulPancake. We started it at around 2009, 2010. I really felt like when The Office had taken off, that I had an imperative to try and do something to make the world better, especially using media. So that's when YouTube was just getting started. And we started by making a website. It was really not very successful, and we didn't really know what we were doing. But then we would do video content, and we would make really kind of cool videos. And we did a bunch for Oprah Winfrey, Super Soul Sunday, and those did really well. And like, we should just make video content. So we really pivoted to that. It was the early days of YouTube, and we launched a YouTube channel, and we ended up with 3 million subscribers pretty early on. So we were doing work with branded entertainment and making a lot of shows. So in those days, the business model was you have a variety of different shows under one channel, they just have super low budgets. So we would try and do shows from anywhere from like $500 to $3,000 an episode, but we would have 10 shows on and of, 5 or 10 episodes each. But so it's like a TV network, but just a super low budget one. And this great young filmmaker who also happened to be a Baha'i, Justin Baldoni, who's in the news these days, God bless him and his journey. He came in with this brilliant idea of My Last Days. And I had been saying to the team, like, I want to do something on death. Like, there's nothing about death, and we need to like really examine death and life and and meaning and how it all fits. And he had this just brilliant idea of like, let's do in-depth portraits of people who have been diagnosed that they don't have much time left. And what can we learn from them? How can we be inspired by people that are facing their mortality? And we ended up making many seasons of the show, and then he made it for the WB network. And they're so many of them just beautiful, just absolutely beautiful. And if you just want to be reminded about how precious life is, you just check out an episode of My Last Days, which is not depressing at all, but it gets you right in the heart bone and really can reinvigorate your sense of being alive.
Yeah. One of the reflections that you wrote on it that was striking to me, you said, not a single subject of My Last Days series said, damn, I had wished I'd worked more or spent more time online or mindlessly scrolling on our phones or gossiping or comparing ourselves to others or in a fog of self-interest pursuing superficial carnal pleasures and material comforts.
That's good. I wrote that?
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. It all comes back to love, connection, meaning, joy, sharing love, expressing love, feeling love. Everything is heart-based. That's what it's all about. We all know that. And between the trappings of the material world and our battle with our insistent self, aka Satan, we get off track very, very easily.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of gets at the idea, obviously every podcast now, SoulBoom, your book, and I think your story itself articulates the need for a spiritual revolution, and for many people to kind of adopt a different perspective of how they're looking at life. And so can you explain to the audience, like, what you mean by spiritual revolution, why you feel like that can be a catalyst for a lot of people in their life?
Well, this idea of a spiritual revolution, of a soul boom, dovetails with so much of what we've been talking about. It comes from my personal story, from the struggles that I've had, the suffering that I've had, and the spiritual journey that I've been on. It comes from a lot of Baha'i ideas, specifically Baha'i ideas, but I try and always make sure that there's no Baha'i agenda. I'm not trying to convert people. I'm just bringing some amazing ideas from this new faith that people might not be familiar with. And I try and, in the conversation, bring in quotes and ideas and stories from the Bible and from the Quran, from the Bhagavad Gita, from Buddhism, a lot of Buddhist ideas, because people are leaving organized religion in droves. That may be changing now. It might, but they have been for the last 50 years. That's a fact. And one of the things I say in SoulBoom is, have we thrown the spiritual baby out with the religious bathwater? So you have this religious bathwater, it's stinky, it's used up, you throw it out, but there was something maybe pure and good and holy and sacred and meaningful that was in it. Have we jettisoned that? Because a lot of people in the current climate of this mental health epidemic, the toxic division that's happening in politics, the grotesque income inequality and injustice that's happening around the world, prejudice, racism, climate change, sexism, the list goes on and on, that there might be a spiritual solution or spiritual tools to help us with these things, both on a personal level and on a societal level. So we may find in Buddhism and the Bible and stories of Jesus, in Baha'i prayers, anywhere, we may find things that help us, that soothe our hearts, that bring us meaning, that connect us, that bring us joy. So I'm not ascribing belonging to any particular religion in the SoulBoom spiritual revolution, but at the same time, I'm not negating people who are already evangelical Christians or born-again Muslims or practicing Buddhists. There are tools in different faith traditions that give us meaning and purpose, and also as a society, as a culture, as human beings on planet Earth, at this incredibly dangerous crux in time, there are tools that we can use collectively to make the world better. And that's something that I think is missing from a lot of spiritual writing. And it is a very Baha'i concept that there is a spiritual obligation. It's called in the Baha'i faith, we call it, sometimes reference it as the twofold moral path, that we have a path to make ourselves deeper, wiser, kinder, gentler, connect to God, calm our anxiety, find purpose, hope, meaning in here, tend this garden. And then we have a moral imperative also to make the world a kinder, better place, to help others, to serve the poor, to bring people together, to unify hearts, to uplift souls, to give, to spread joy, to build community. These are spiritual impetuses, and at their best, that's what church does. At its best, church is a beautiful community of like-minded people in service to the poor. That if someone in the congregation gets sick, a different hot dish shows up every night at their doorstep, that calls are made, that people are embraced, that they're singing together, that it's praise of the all glorious and in emulation of the works and life of Jesus Christ. At its best, organized religion can be like that, and needs to spread out from the walls of the church into the community, and then into the community, into people that are not like us at all, people that might be the most different than us, and might be suffering the most, with a great increase in compassion for others that impels us to help those less fortunate, and to take some of these spiritual ideas and try and build community and uplift the suffering, like Jesus did, like the Buddha did, like Muhammad did. So that's what a SoulBoom spiritual revolution is about. And I'm just trying to start a conversation about it. I mean, I didn't really believe that the book or the podcast would incite a spiritual revolution, but at least we're having a conversation, and 10 or 100,000 people are going to listen to this and maybe ponder it a little bit. And how can I bring a spiritual revolution into my life and into my community?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly starting a conversation. I mean, I was reading the book a month ago, and I was sitting in South Street Seaport in a coffee shop, and this person comes up to me, taps me on the shoulder, and she's like, "Oh, I've been really wanting to read that book. It's on my list. Like, how is it?" And so it was just interesting. I mean, you have so many interactions in the online world, but like just in the physical world, someone coming up at a coffee shop saying that to me. But I feel like there's been a real shift in the way we view spirituality in the past 5 to 7 years. And what I mean by that is we came from this very hardcore atheist, four horsemen of atheists, like type of mentality with Richard Dawkins, a lot of influence, Sam Harris, stuff like that, of there is no God, like religion sucks, and let's just do away with all of that. And I think there's just like this tendency for humanity to gravitate back towards a more spiritual worldview. But I find it to be interesting about what you said with the twofold spiritual path is that you kind of get back to the ideas of what we just talked about with the self, which is that a lot of people are using spirituality as this thing to better the self, and then they stop there, which is you talked about in SoulBoom. They stop there, and then it's not about making the world a better place. It's about basically how can I make myself better and not really care about anybody else. And I think those two ideas together are really special. Like, yes, we need help with our own mental health. Yes, we need to heal from our generational trauma. And then we also need to like go out and like make the world a better place, because I feel like that's where purpose is. That's where meaning is.
100%. And it's one of the things that pisses me off so much about kind of big city, blue state spirituality is how solipsistic it is. And like, I meditate because it calms me down. I go to yoga class because it brings me joy. And I listen to the Goop podcast because it makes me feel healthier. And then that's it. Like, spirituality is something that you buy on a one-click shopping on Amazon because it, like, I need a coat hanger. So I go to Amazon, I go one click buy, and I get a coat hanger and it holds my coat, as if spirituality is like something that fixes my dysregulation. And then that's it. And yes, of course, there are spiritual tools to fix your dysregulation. Great. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're absolutely right. It's so navel-gazy. How do you take then, okay, you've found a little bit of meaning, peace, wonder, joy, whatever it is, tranquility, serenity. What is your charge then as a spiritual being on this planet? Again, it goes back to that question. Okay, if there is a God, what does God want from us? What is our purpose? And I guarantee you it's not to just kind of like sit in your nice house and drive your BMW and feel more tranquil than you did a few days earlier. Like, there are people really suffering. There are great divisions in the world. And another Baha'i way of looking at what's happening in the world right now is there are two forces at work at the exact same time, the forces of integration and the forces of disintegration. It's hard for young people to see that because all you see is disintegration, but then you're like, but my friends are so cool and they want to do cool things and they're saying cool things and I love this movement, or I love this incredible, teacher. I love, Dr. Lisa Miller and her writings. And how do I rectify this? It's like, well, there's two things happening at the exact same time. The world is falling apart. Old systems are not working. The center cannot hold, to quote Yeats, a widening gyre. And at the same time, things are cohering in new, exciting, and profound ways. So your job is to take that spiritual charge that you've given your batteries and adhere yourself to communities of people that are trying to make the world a better place that you identify with, and hitch your wagons to forces of integration and try and integrate some of these ideas.
It's really powerful and beautiful. I think that the modern day association with spirituality has even gotten heavily associated with psychedelics, and like the rise of psychedelics with Michael Pollan's documentary on Netflix, and then just a curiosity around how that can aid a spiritual journey. I mean, you had some strong opinions about the psychedelic stuff in your book. So what is your take on that whole movement?
Well, I'm old enough to remember the psychedelic movement from the 60s and 70s. So I remember, because my parents had a lot of people coming through talking about spiritual ideas. I remember people talking about LSD being the answer to the world problems. If everyone just did LSD in 1975, we'd have world peace. So that this is an old conversation. Well, it's a 50-year-old conversation, 60-year-old conversation, right? This isn't new. It's just taking off now because of how social media works. But yeah, I have pretty strong opinions that is a selfish, stupid waste of time. And again, I've met people that have done a very powerful ayahuasca ceremony and had an understanding of their own consciousness and a divine force in a profoundly new way. And I would never begrudge anyone that. That's wonderful. That's beautiful. But again, just like I was talking about, like, a person in LA driving their BMW who listen to a meditation app or in a Goop podcast and go to a yoga class in order to get their, in a consumerist mentality to get their spirituality. I feel like 99% of all psychedelic use is kind of like, I want a shortcut.
Yeah.
I want a shortcut to God. I want a shortcut to enlightenment. So I'm going to fly down to this resort in Costa Rica, and there's a shaman, and we'll be in the conference room, and, and we'll all trip balls, and I'll see the face of God, and people's faces will melt, and I'll feel one with the cosmos. And then I'm going to go back to my 60-hour work week, and just buying shit and like driving my kids to soccer practice and, working too hard and living my miserable fucking life, but had an amazing ceremony with a shaman who was actually a guy named Pedro from Mexico City who has a yoga studio or something like that. Like it's not, it's so, and people will be like, yes, but psychedelics have been in human history since the dawn of time. Yeah. And guess what? They were a part of a ceremony and they were part of a culture and they're connected to nature, and they weren't doing them every other weekend, and they weren't doing them at a resort in Costa Rica or at a Holiday Inn, in San Jose. It was woven into the fabric and identity of tribal life and how they viewed God and how they viewed nature and the sacredness of plants and plant medicine. And it's generation after generation, there's a sacredness to it. So if you really want to do it, then go live with a tribe for a couple years and get to know them and know their ways and do it as part of this sacred ceremony. Don't fly down on a 3-day weekend. And I know I can feel the comments and the hate, and I get so much pushback and defensiveness and hate around this. 'Cause it's kind of anti-Rogan, but I think challenge yourself to do the harder work. It's way harder to find transcendence on a meditation retreat or on a hike or on a mountaintop or in service to others or in community with others. It's hard to be in community with others.
Yeah.
It's one of the hardest things we can do. Like consultation and building consensus and creating a deep, respectful, loving community is one of the hardest human endeavors there is. But challenge yourself a little bit more.
Yeah, I think your pushback on it is important. I mean, I take the view. I think there's a lot of things that you're consistent. I mentioned the trauma doctor that we had on, and he kind of had a similar view in the sense of this guy has been dealing with trauma and helping people with trauma for 30 years, and MDMA, people, so much interest around that of psychedelics healing MDMA healing people's trauma, and so he was talking about how the integration sessions in between the medicine sessions with the psychedelics it's equally as important, if not more important. So it's you do this thing under the supervision of a couple doctors, and then the processing that you do in between those sessions. And so I think that the fallacy with psychedelics when it comes to mental health is I'm just gonna take a pill and it's gonna be all over, which was done with SSRIs and stuff 30 years ago. There's actually a deep work that needs to be done in the midst of that, which I think is really important and gets to the idea that you're talking about. And so, yeah, I think that, you're pushing back and there's probably going to be comments about it.
And listen, this is completely separate from therapeutic uses of MDMA or psychedelics or whatever, or mushrooms or whatever, to treat trauma, to treat veterans, to treat really deep depression, and other treatments have not worked, like the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, work that's done with doctors and supervision, and great consciousness and care as a treatment tool, 100% in favor of. That's such a minuscule percentage of the people that are using these drugs, because that's what they are. They're just drugs. It's just a different drug.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that, in a positive sense, that psychedelics is raising a conversation about is consciousness, which you talk about heavily in your book, and it's kind of this black box for science, right? In terms of not really being able to understand consciousness and how the mind works. Can you share some of like the insights and thoughts that you had on that in the book?
Yeah, it's interesting. We get some emails coming in to SoulBoom sometimes, and sometimes I'll scroll through some of them. And someone wrote in and was like, "You talk a lot about consciousness on the show. It's very simple. Our brains do not have any will of their own. We are hardwired with these brains, and then we have external stimuli, and due to our training and culture and the responses of our nervous system, we respond. We do not have free will, and this is what consciousness is. It's simply the responding to stimulus that we receive through the eyes and the senses." And, and it was this long like treatise, and it's like, you read it and you're just like, no, no, that's not it. No one believes that. No one believes that. A couple of people at Harvard and Stanford maybe believe that. And a couple of, online nerds maybe believe that. And a handful of hardcore atheists, but people don't believe that because that's not our experience. Consciousness is a fucking miracle. When I held my baby son after he almost died in childbirth, my wife almost died in childbirth in a hallway in Van Nuys in 2004 at 4 a.m. and looked into his bright blue eyes and sobbed and felt meaning and a kind of a love I'd never experienced before. Like, I'm sorry, that's not just stimula and a kind of fleshy computer in my cranium. Like, when I witness a Radiohead concert, when I witness a Cézanne painting, when I read a poem and it makes me well up, when I am singing with a group of men at a men's retreat, on a mountaintop, and as the sun is rising, and I feel part of something bigger than myself. Like, this is what consciousness is. And when I read incredible books that make me think and feel and change the course of my life because of the ideas of that author, like, this is consciousness. It is an absolute undefinable miracle. And science says decade after decade is like, well, as soon as we do a few more brain maps and figure out like where things live in the brain, doink, 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 here's love, here's your child, here's the geography of sitting in a hospital hallway, here's the love of your wife, here's feeling meaning. And then we'll understand consciousness, just with more brain scans and MRIs. And it's like, no, I'm sorry. It's not, And then, I bring up the case of, there's this famous case of this boy born without a brain. And guess what? Has everything that we have. You can look it up.
What is this case?
This kid was born without a brain, just like basic brain stem. And they're like, oh, he's going to be a vegetable his whole life. And then they just raised him and kept loving him and reading to him and educating him. And he has like no brain, and he has like a fully rich life. I have to figure out the name. Maybe someone can Google it. But, or maybe he just had a tiny chunk of a brain. Like but I don't want to argue it on scientific terms. I want to argue it on an appeal to one's heart, like our experience of being moved, interacting with people, having memories. You smell a flower and it reminds you of your childhood, and you think of your dead mother and you shed a tear, and then you're increased love, and then you give that to someone else. Like, that's not, a gooey computer in a cranium. You may say that it is and theorize that it is, and teach it in a classroom that it is, but we all know that's not it. We all know that there's something more. It's so many things, near-death experiences, dreams. They still can't explain. Well, dreams are every 5 or 10 years, they kind of explain what dreams are, and no one has a slightest understanding of any of this, and they're not getting any closer, but they, God bless the scientists, and, keep marching forward. But consciousness is one of the three great central mysteries of the universe.
Yeah. I mean, I actually do think that like it can be argued on scientific terms. And what I mean by that is any scientific idea, it's like before it becomes like mass adopt, it's like the person who got it right like 50 years ago was like, oh, he's a kook. Like, and then it's like, oh, wait, no, he was actually right. And so like neuroplasticity is one of those ideas that people were like, this is so kooky in the 1960s. This makes actually no sense. And now
the brain can repair itself and rewire itself? Like, no.
And now every single neuroscientist is like, no, this is the way that the brain works. And so the two fields in science that really kind of put this in perspective for me in terms of consciousness and like what it actually is and, you know, us being spiritual or is it the material world all that exists is we've both had Lisa Miller on our podcast. And, you know, she's kind of one of the trailblazers in the field of studying the science of spirituality. And so after all her research, she kind of hypothesized that like the brain is like an idea generator. It's kind of like a antenna or like docking station for like a larger consciousness, which I thought was really interesting because she's coming from that from a neuroscience, like psychology perspective. And then you mentioned the near-death experience thing. And so a lot of people don't know that that is probably the field that sits square at the middle between spirituality and like science. And so like the field of near-death study has been around for 50 years. And if you read these stories of these people who, let's just say you're on a medical table and the doctor's there to verify like what's happening. This person goes into cardiac arrest, they die, no heartbeat, like brain dead. And then all of a sudden they're describing how they like float out of their body, floating down the hallway, see their mother crying by the vending machine, like getting like a Kit Kat out of the machine. And then some crazy thing happens that they come back in their body and they survive this experience. But the doctor can verify that they were dead, at least momentarily. And then there's just no way.
And then they will ask their mom, how was the Kit Kat bar? And the mom will be like, how the fuck did you know? You were dead in a room, you know, 100 yards away when I was getting that Kit Kat car. How the hell did you know?
Exactly.
And there's so many stories like that.
Yeah.
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 Sebastian Junger was on our show, and he had a near-death experience. He's a dyed-in-the-wool atheist. It's a fascinating book called In My Time of Dying. Highly recommended. It reads like a thriller, and he talks us through his near-death experience. And he did a ton of research into near-death experiences coming from an atheistic materialist standpoint. And he said, you know, everything can be explained. Like there's a reaction of the brain here floating above the body, can be hallucination. You know, there's this incredible amounts of like dopamine that fled your brain. That's almost like MDMA or like a ketamine or something like that, dissociative drug. And, you know, the tunnel of light, all of these things can be explained. But the one thing that can't be explained is why is it in every culture of the world? Why do you witness your ancestors? Why do you have an interaction with a cousin, a family member, a chorus of people welcoming you, your father who died the year before? Why in every culture of the world throughout time are you visited by loved ones and have an interaction with a loved one? That can't be scientifically explained. Like, why would everyone have that exact same hallucination?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of his objections, though, I mean, the book that was very formational for me on this was by Dr. Bruce Grayson, 2021. He's probably like the leading scientist in this field. He's like almost 80 years old now. But, and he doesn't really let on like what he is, like what he spiritually believes. I think that's, I don't know, part of the shtick of being a scientist. But he went through all these theories of, oh, it's the function of the dying brain. And he kind of just masterfully, one by one, explained why all these things like didn't make any sense. And so we invited one of his colleagues, Dr. Jen Holden. She's the editor of like a scholarly peer-reviewed journal that goes through all these near-death studies. And she was just kind of talking about all these different instances. And so, I mean, a lot of people, I mean, I talked to Alex O'Connor about this like over dinner as well. And when he was on our podcast, and, you know, it's just fascinating because someone from an atheist view, of course, you come up with like all these different explanations of like, that could have happened, that could have happened, that could have happened.
Which is similar to consciousness. Like,
yeah.
It could be this and it could be that and it could be, yeah.
But, the Occam's razor thing of like, the simplest explanation is often the right one, I think.
People of science and materialism love Occam's razor, except when it's applied for, actually, there's a spiritual answer that is the simplest, most reasonable, and easiest to access of all. Then they're like, oh, that doesn't apply.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
So I think a lot of these ideas, so if people are like, okay, Rainn, like maybe we need a spiritual revolution, I think there's a number of kind of roadblocks that we kind of need to navigate through to address, so people can figure out like, okay, what do I even like do with this? One of those obviously is the stigma surrounding religion, which has kind of been a conduit in some ways for people to express their spirituality. So if you were to explain in your own words, like, how would you differentiate between what people typically think about with religion and spirituality?
That's such a great question. It's such an important question. I don't know that I have an answer. I mean, that's a puzzler right there. And it's one that I have wrestled with. I have a friend, Dr. Derek Smith, and he's a professor at Claremont College, and he once said very wisely, he goes, everyone on the political left, everyone who's like spiritual but not religious, they say, I can't be part of an organized religion. Mm-hmm. They don't want a systematization of belief or action. But he goes, but the forces of darkness are very well organized. The forces of division are incredibly well systematized. They've got their shit together. They've got their marching order. They've got their fundraising. The forces that are making the world a worse place are very well organized. And then there's this other side that's kind of like, just let me have my own experience with my tree, and with my yoga and with my little meditation practice that I do, and don't tell me what to do. And it's a very natural reaction, because we see the kind of like the judgment and the trauma that so many religious faiths have practiced. And you look at what's going on in Gaza right now. Like, Islam means peace, and the Jewish people greet each other with shalom, which is peace. And they're both kidnapping and bombing the shit out of each other and ripping each other apart. I know it's much more complicated than, why can't we just sing Kumbaya and hug each other and hold hands? But still, as a young person, you see that, you're just like, again, you're like me, you're like, fuck all y'all. I don't want anything to do with this religion crap. But I would say that as systems collapse and fall apart, we need new systems and new ways of thinking about how to bring people together. And a religion is simply a codified, organized collection of belief. At its best, Christianity, for example. At its best, Christianity allows for a wide range of Christians, right? You can have Unitarian Universalists holding hands and eating, cupcakes and singing, Jesus loves me songs. And you can have, Orthodox Christian or born again or, speaking in tongues and evangelical churches. And, you can have, but all of that can be allowed, under one Christian umbrella.
Yeah.
But I think that there is strength in numbers. I think there's strength and power in community. I think religion, there's several things. I'm kind of rambling a little bit because I don't quite know how to answer this question. So I'm gonna go back to the book SoulBoom and say, when people look at the world's religions, they see great differences. I see great similarities. And I talk about the 10 universal truths that bind all religions, whether it's Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism, that a community of people coming together using prayer and meditation, believing in a power that's greater than them, seeking transcendence, giving service to others, being part of something larger than themselves. That's a handful of universals of every religion. That is when humanity is at its very best, is when we're doing all of those things. So organized religion, I think, plays a very important role and will play a very important role in the spiritual revolution and in the transformation of humanity from where it is now to one of great world peace and human unity and harmony. That's going to come. There may be tremendous hardship along the way, but it's going to come. And organized religion has a role to play if it's harnessed for good.
Yeah, I mean, I think really what in essence you're getting at is like there is true religion, and then there's these kind of caricatures of then distortions of then what it's used for. And I think this can be summed up in the simple thing that you did in the book, which is the Latin word for religion.
Mm-hmm. Religion comes from the Latin religio, which is to rebind or connect, to bind people. Ligio, like ligament. Mm-hmm. And religion's purpose is to bind people together, again, to a common cause, to service to the poor, to God, to love, to an ever-expanding community. It's not to divide. It's not to talk about people burning in hell. It's not talking about judgment against, LGBTQ folk or whatever. It's not about saying our religion is better than yours and we're going to, blow each other up.
And you don't need religion for that. I mean, there's other things that are not religious. I mean, politics is an example. There are ideas in this world, even if you just completely throw away a spiritual worldview, we're going to end up being like the worst parts of humanity are going to come out, whether you have religion or not.
Absolutely. And so many of the world's greatest catastrophes have happened at the hands of people that don't have any religion at all. Whether it's the Chinese Revolution or Pol Pot or Adolf Hitler, there have been plenty of examples without any religion in the picture whatsoever of humans just doing the worst behaviors to one another.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one idea, which is also something that's ironic that people struggle with, is this idea of right and wrong. And it's like we speak as if like, okay, we don't like those terms anymore. And I've had so many conversations with people personally or even on the pod. It's like, I don't want to use the word right and wrong anymore, except everything about our lives, we act as if like right and wrong exists, which is like an idea that you've talked about.
Morality is a really interesting topic, and it's a difficult one. And young people do not want to hear about morality. They especially don't want to hear about like morality coming from some kind of divine law or a higher power. And I get it, because morality has been used like a crowbar and beaten people into submission and threatened with burning in hell. And there's been shame and judgment around it, and I completely understand. But to think that morality just comes from like what you feel in your heart about right and wrong, or an impulse or common sense about what makes sense about right and wrong, or to think that it just comes from like a socially agreed upon set of ethics, is to me silly. That, it has always been these incredible movements founded by spiritual teachers that have brought true moral evolution to humanity, whether it's the Buddha, whether it's Krishna, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, now Baha'u'llah. There has been this, gradual instilling of ever deeper moral ideas into consciousness. And 150 years ago, 180 years ago, let's say, if you were to go around and be like, hey, is it immoral to own slaves? People would be like, no, it's not immoral. Are you kidding? Our entire economy is based on it. Humans have owned slaves for tens of thousands of years. This is just the way it is. It's survival of the fittest. And those people aren't really even human anyway. This is true. This is absolutely true. Other than a handful, a tiny minority of abolitionists. This is how most people thought. So that's morality. that was morality clung to by what people felt in their hearts, what their intuition led them to believe, what the society around them led them to believe. And now we're like, that is ludicrous, dangerous, and an abomination in
Well, we would say
human
that's
history.
wrong. We would say that is wrong,
And we say it's wrong.
which is a moral stance.
Yeah.
So it's like we still take a moral stance on something. Yeah, it's like it's such a weird thing. It's like we can say racism is wrong, but we don't want to use right and wrong when it comes to just many different aspects of life. But it just seems like this inherent thing that we do. We make these distinctions. I mean, you see it with the political cycle as well. It's like we say they're bad, we're good, or whatever.
Yeah. One side might say they're wrong to deport, illegal immigrants in chains on airplanes in the middle of the night. The other side might say it's wrong to be letting people in without legal work visas into the United States. And both sides are saying wrong, the other side wrong, and immoral even. But you're absolutely right.
So then why do you feel like young people in particular pretend like it doesn't exist?
It's, to quote Al Gore, it's an inconvenient truth. There is right and wrong. A lot of those are eternals. A lot of those go beyond kind of mere culture. And that's a difficult way to live one's life, to try and follow a moral creed, strictures, that's what I think. It's hard. It's easier to be like, hey man, don't lay that on me. I'm just going to drift along and make my own choices about what's right and wrong. And it's just, that's an easier way to be in the world. I think it's harder to kind of say, hey, like in the Baha'i faith, one of the strongest moral strictures, is that even a word? I think it's a word, is no backbiting, no gossip. So talking about other people negatively when they're not around is one of the hardest things to do. It's 30% of every human conversation. But really in the Baha'i faith, it's akin to some of the worst crimes. And I fail at it daily, but I keep trying. And I do believe that law is there for our protection. And for humanity to grow and mature, we need to stop spending so much time backstabbing and gossiping about each other.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of where, I love this cross dynamic between science and spirituality. I actually go back to these higher virtues and whatever you want to call it, lower virtues or sins or whatever you want to call them. A lot of them have been studied. And so like gratitude has been studied by science and there's enormous amount. So we could let's just say gratitude is good, quote unquote, whatever you want to say. Anger, lashing out in someone in anger is scientifically destructive. Mm-hmm. And so they've studied a lot of these things that we reject as bad or good or certain behaviors. And I think it just kind of furthers the idea of like, how does the world actually work? And what are certain things that are going to be completely counterproductive towards love of myself and love of my neighbor? And recognizing that about that we have these tendencies inside of ourselves, because I think one thing that has just kind of gotten lost in our culture is this idea of the human condition. And so religions have tried to diagnose that with, we're all quote unquote sinners or other things. But I mean, I think you need to recognize within your own self, like there's good, there's like altruism, there's like, I was just talking to my wife offline about how one time our dog ran in the street and all of the cars stopped. It's like, we can't run over this dog. So clearly there's something within the human condition that is good. But then the opposite of that would be there's clearly things that we do where we act in self-interest, like going back to the Satan example. And so
from a traffic example, everyone's lined up to go down an exit, and then there's always some asshole who comes up to the front and just ducks in, especially in Los Angeles, screw all those, 200 people, like I'm more important or I'm more late or something like that. So Yeah. Or all of those people that came to a stop with the dog in the street, and that's beautiful. Thank you, whoever you are. Thank you so much. People are dying in the Sudan, in the Congo, in Gaza, in Yemen, in Ukraine. Children are being bombed. People are starving to death. No one's really doing anything about it. So we can stop for a dog in the street, but what are we doing to help our fellow man that's at the worst kind of level of suffering?
Yeah.
And that might sound moralistic. It is moralistic. That's moralistic. I mean, Jesus talked about, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Think of the least among you. Like, this is a moral imperative, because religions know how to contain humans' animalistic impulses towards envy, like in backbiting, towards greed, sloth, backstabbing, one-upsmanship. Religions at their best know how to contain and constrain that and allow for an expression of those higher qualities like gratitude and love.
Yeah, and I think the key here, and you've said this throughout, is I don't think people should look at their own bad behavior or their gossiping in this shame-based way. And I think that's part of the reason why people hate organized religion is because of the shame. And it's more of like a humble stance of, I have good in me, I have bad in me, and recognizing like sometimes I have a tendency towards the bad, and like, how do I improve that? How do I work with that? Rather than having someone throw like shame, like, oh, you're bad, like you're a sinner, like something like that. I feel like people hate that. And so that goes back to the idea of true religion versus this distorted picture, shame-based type mentality.
Well, the original translation in the Bible of sin was hamartia, which in the Greek meant to miss the mark. It was an archery term. And that was translated into sin in Latin, I believe. Some people may debate me on this, but this is what I understand. And that hamartia, missing the mark, like sin is not a black mark on your soul, burn in hell. Sin is like you miss the mark. I miss the mark with backbiting. Like,
on love, you're missing the mark on love, yeah.
And I'm missing the mark on loving to my maximum capacity. I'm missing the mark on gossiping. And I struggle with that, like I said, every day. And that's not like a sin, I'm bad, shame, self-flagellation. It's kind of like put your next arrow in the quiver and try and hit the mark again better the next day.
Yeah. I mean, so the morality thing, roadblock, religion thing, roadblock. I mean, and the third thing that kind of is a huge, and you just mentioned it, which is suffering. And so to see people in Sudan suffering, I think people have like a really hard time with that. And I've had a really hard time with that in my own journey of like, the things that really get me are like the genetic cancers or like if I could write off, and it doesn't make it like any better, but in some way I could reconcile in my mind, like, okay, if someone went out and like murdered a ton of people, it's like an act of human will, like an act of what we were just talking about. But, the idea that, someone is born with this deformity, someone gets ALS and then is like a vegetable in a chair, like stuck in their own body. It's a really hard thing to deal with. And I thought your insights in SoulBoom were quite profound about this.
Oh, thanks.
And so what would your response be to somebody who's like, God can't exist because of suffering, or I just can't deal with suffering in general. This makes me reject it.
There's a couple things. If in the Baha'i cosmology, the human soul is created at conception. Our first life is in the womb. Why are we in the womb? We're in the womb to grow the eyes and ears and hands and hair and elbows and feet that we need to exist in this physical universe. What then are we doing in this physical universe? Well, we're growing our spiritual capacities and qualities of kindness, love, humility, compassion that we will take with us in the next part of our journey, that we're all going on. There's not heaven and hell. We're going to infinite planes of existence, infinite worlds of God till we meet our Creator. So if we look at the fact that there are infinite worlds of God ever unfolding, each one more mysterious, beautiful, magnificent than the last, it's so tragic and unfortunate, a baby born with a cancer, and heartbreaking for the family, heartrending, and indescribably bad. I would never even pretend to know what that could remotely feel like. But if you look at it in that context, it's the blink of an eye in our journeys of our souls. So we tend to look at this world as the illusion of this world is that this world is all there is, and that it's super, super important. That's one way of looking at it. The other way is, how would it work in the opposite extreme, where there was no suffering on this physical plane? How would that work? That vaginas open to the size of bowling ball bags and babies fall out without any crying, and they're caught on satin pillows, and they breathe, no problem. They never stub their toe. They never skin their knee. Bones never break. There's no diseases. Everyone dies gently and peacefully at age 100.
Well, Alex O'Connor would say, why can't that world exist?
But when you think about that world, it's ludicrous. It can't exist because A, there would be no science in it. So, and B, what kind of God would create a world like that? That's just a weird, that's like a world someone would create like in Second Life online or something like that. It's, to me, that world seems preposterous, because what we've been talking about this whole time is how suffering leads to wisdom, and suffering is a part of this material world. Do we understand exactly why that is? Does it seem fair all the time? No, it doesn't seem fair. I had a couple of friends a couple of years back just drop dead. One guy, aneurysm, one guy, heart attack, just like walking along, happy as a clam, boom, sends the family into a tailspin. I have a friend, his daughter got a brain tumor and his wife got a brain tumor at the same time. Like, that's so unfair. It's awful. It's heartbreaking. It's awful. I don't know how exactly the suffering works, but kind of, don't you get a sense a little bit, like the Buddha said, to quote the Buddha, life is suffering. Like, unfortunately, why did you make this universe or this plane to be so much about suffering? There's so much goddamn suffering, pun intended, going on here. But that's part of our reality, is like peaceful repose and a joyous acquiescence in the midst of great suffering has always been the spiritual journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of zooming out to a spiritual perspective is important. And I've thought about it like, it's a Kevin Bacon's film, Six Degrees of Separation, or something that he made in the early 90s. But the idea that my journey could be connected to your journey, could be connected to your journey, could be connected to your journey. And so if you zoom out with an omniscient creator or divine being or whatever you want to call it, the great mystery, whatever, and then you zoom into story, like all 8 billion stories, like weaving together, and why that guy, why your friend dropped dead of an aneurysm on the spot, is beyond the limits of human knowledge. And so, but there could be a higher order, higher purpose at play. Maybe he drops out of an aneurysm, which then catalyzes this other person to do this other thing, which catalyzes this person to do the other thing. And then all of a sudden they solve world hunger. I don't know. It's something like that. Like there's these trickle down effects, almost like a game of dominoes, that could potentially be at play. But I think when we're in our own feelings in the moment, and because we only have our own human lens into this entire scenario, it's very hard to grapple with that when it's happening to you, when it's happening to somebody that you love. And yeah.
We all know people who have undergone such great and seemingly unjust suffering that has severed them from God, and they've left the church, or they've left their faith, or they've left their belief in God. when that happened. Like my friend whose daughter and wife both got brain tumors. He was like, there's no way there's a God that they would do this. I mean, come on. It's just too much.
The other thing that is interesting about suffering is going back to acting. If you've studied storytelling, if you've studied film scripts, any interesting part of a film involves struggle or suffering. Like, it's interesting. Like, nobody would find a film to be interesting that had no suffering in it. Like, if you think about like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's like, okay,
I'd rather not.
But, Iron Man comes down. There is no villain. He just is happy and he flies around. And
this goes with the universe that I was describing, where no one skins a knee and no one stubs a toe and there's no pain. And then what movies do they watch? Because there's no conflict, right? And there's no pain and there's no accidents. So you're absolutely right. Then that is a world that is story free.
Yeah,
that's a great. I'm going to steal that. Can I use that?
Oh, you can.
Thank you
if you want to. But I mean, it's and then even in a podcast interview, if you interview someone who's had a perfect life their entire life, it's like not even interesting. No one's going to want to watch that.
Yeah.
And so I think those are just aspects of suffering that we don't think about. And so, you have the suffering thing, you have the morality thing, you have people wrestling with religion. I'm almost certain that people are going to be listening to this and they are a Christian, they are a Muslim, and they're going to be like, I'm calling bullshit on you, Rainn, because I'm a Christian and this is the only path. Or Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Or a Muslim will say, well, no, this is the only path.
There's no God but Allah.
Yeah.
And Muhammad is his prophet, and Muhammad is the seal of the prophets.
Exactly. So if someone was saying you're being selective with what you choose to be the similarities and then what you are omitting, like, what is your response to that?
So let's go back to the very beginning. We talked about my journey to decide whether or not there was a creator or not, a force, an unknowable essence, a source. And I came to believe that there was. I couldn't conceive of a universe without this force, source, unknowable essence, all-powerful, all-loving creator. Okay, put that aside. The next part of the question is, what does this source, force, unknowable essence, source of all good, what does it want from us? What the hell is going on with 8 billion humans on planet Earth, each one with a different consciousness? Like, what are we supposed to do with this information? Well, to a Christian, to a certain kind of Christian, it's very simple. They read the Bible, they read the New Testament. They're like, this makes sense to me. I love the stories of Jesus. It resonates powerfully with me. I have a tradition and a culture of Christianity that I admire and I look up to. And Jesus says, I am the way and the light, and there's no way to the Father except through me. And that's it. Case closed. These other paths, good luck to you, Buddhist. Good luck to you, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, spiritual, not religious, what have you. This is the truth. And that's fine, because guess what? Like I said, the central Baha'i teaching is the individual investigation of truth. Everyone gets to discover the truth for themselves. And if that is true for you, you may think it's true for everyone and that people who are non-believers are going to burn in hell. That's fine. We'll see what happens, in the next life. We'll see what goes on there, if that's true or not. But then that is your course. And maybe part of your course is to try and convince other people that Jesus is the way and the life, and there's no way to the Father except through him. And that's it. Case closed. I investigated all these books. I read all these books. I read the Quran. I went to a mosque. I investigated. I read some books about Islam, histories. I read the Bible. I did some Bible study. I went to some Buddhist meetings and meditated and read the Dhammapadas of the Buddha. I read the Bhagavad Gita, and in Hinduism, I read books about religion, etc. I came back to the Baha'i faith, which incorporates all of them, which says that they're all pieces of the same puzzle, that it's all like an ongoing course, that you humanity has these divine teachers that come every 500 or 1,000 years and help educate humanity spiritually and morally, bringing us towards an eventual maturation. That Baha'u'llah, whose name means the glory of God, is the newest of these divine teachers. And I went with that, maybe because I was raised that way, and that was my Sunday school classes were along those lines, and maybe it felt more familiar to me. But we all make that choice. And there may be people that say, hey, I've investigated all of these different paths, these existing organized religions paths. I appreciate stuff about all of them, but I'm going to choose none of the above. And this is the largest growing, population in young Americans is spiritual but not religious. And I'm going to choose to try and live a spiritual life and respect and love my Muslim brothers and sisters and Hindu and Buddhist and Christian and Baha'i brothers and sisters. It's going to be a buffet table. I'm going to take what I like and leave the rest. This is meaningful to me. I'm going to try and even convince other people to come along that path. That's fine too. I think at the end of the day, I believe that the all-loving, unknowable essence that pervades all things, that is within us, that is without us, that is beyond space and time, doesn't really give a fuck at the end of the day, as long as you are on a twofold moral path, making yourself the best possible person you can be and trying to make the world a better place and relieve the suffering of others. That it doesn't really matter. But I do think that for a spiritual revolution to take place, that the people of all these different faiths, including the people that are spiritual but not religious, need to be working together and in harmony and accepting our differences and say, hey, I agree to disagree. God bless you. You believe that there's no road to salvation or heaven except through Jesus. Okay, great. I love you. Let's work together. How do we make the world a better place? Because it's falling apart right now.
I'm so curious, did you ever almost become a Muslim or almost become a Christian? Was there any moment of investigating these texts where you're like, I'm very convinced that this is the path?
Well, there's going to piss a lot of people off. As a Baha'i, I am a Muslim. As a Baha'i, I am a Christian. As a Baha'i, I am a Buddhist. That's how I look at it. I love Jesus as much, if not more, than most Christians. And I'm familiar with the Bible, and I study it, and I read it, and I love it. And I believe there is no way to the Father except through Jesus. And I believe there's no way to the Father except through Muhammad. And I believe there's no way to the Father except through Baha'u'llah, because these divine teachers that come down, they bring the path toward the divine. So this is getting very Baha'i lecture-y, but it's just what I feel.
Well, no, I think it's important to investigate what exactly you're saying, because I guess this.
And so for me, did I almost become one of these things in a way and it might be, people will say it's a cheat, but I do believe that as a Baha'i, I get to acknowledge that the divinity and brilliance of all of these different world faiths. I get to incorporate them into my belief, and I get to go along with Baha'u'llah's mission and message to try and make the world a better place. Well, but if I was going to be anything, I would either be a Buddhist or a Catholic at the end of the day. If I wasn't going to be a Baha'i, I love Catholic mysticism, and I love Aquinas. I love the ceremonies. I love the mystery of the church. I love Thomas Merton is my homeboy, and but I also can really get with Buddhism, and I think Buddhism actually has the most teachings that you can just instantly turn to make your life better. If you just want to make your life better and happier and richer, go to Buddhism, and you're gonna find 12 tools in the toolbox. You open it up, and there's a screwdriver and a wrench and a socket wrench or whatever, and they're gonna make your life richer and happier, like that.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the Baha'i idea of the individual investigation of the truth, I think these distinctions, even though you are talking about Baha'i now, I think is universally applicable to all humans, because at the end of the day, you're going to start opening up these texts potentially, and then it's part of that is your interpretation of what that text means, obviously, because, there's the traditional theological interpretations of what the Quran means or what the Bible means.
Mm-hmm.
And, to a Christian, for example, that might be listening, it's like they've studied theology, or they take down their theology from their pastor or their priest, and they talk about, this is how we read the Bible, and this is what it means, and this is the whole history behind it. And so when you hit up against, this idea is a little bit different here in the Quran versus the Bible, like, what is your process of going through reading and evaluating these texts and making these kind of insights that you're coming up with?
Yeah, so if you look at the Gospels and you ask yourself the question, was Jesus God? This was one of the most important questions to early Christians, right? Would you agree? First 300, 500 years of Christianity, was Jesus God or a man, was one of the biggest questions. And you look through the Gospels, it's about 50-50. There are quotes, and we've been talking for like 3 hours, so my brain's a little fried, but there are quotes of like, I and the Father are one, and there are quotes of, why do you ask me this? This is a question of good. Only the Father is good. And that, what the hell is going on? Is he one with the Father, or is the Father something separate and good and beyond him? Why does he say on the cross, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? If he's God, and this is a theological question that's still being debated today in Fuller Seminary Institute down the road, and everyone's talking about it, right? But a couple things. One is you get to make up your mind about that, because about half the churches, 2/3 of the churches say Jesus is God. And they just kind of conveniently ignore all the stuff that has to do with Jesus talking about God as something separate and beyond him, and him calling himself the Son of Man, and him calling God the Father. You can go with Aquinas as the man God, or the God man, as he referred to Jesus, which is kind of how I view it. Or you can believe in a triune God. You get to figure this out, and you can go to your church on this corner that's triune God, and this corner that Jesus is just a man like all of us and has the Father, and they conveniently ignore all the stuff where he says he is God. And you could go to this church that's Jesus is God, and anyone who thinks otherwise is going to hell, which exists. And so you get to make that choice. From my perspective as a Baha'i, when I look at like that theological issue, I view so much of spiritual teaching as living in the realm of metaphor. When I read the Bible and I hear about Jesus healing lepers or healing the blind, I was blind and now I can see, raising the dead. Did he raise the dead? Did he cure leprosy? Did he cure blindness? Maybe he did. Probably he did some of that, right?
And is that possible in today's world then?
Well, then you go into miracles. That's a whole other conversation. Yeah. But I will say that also it works metaphorically. And I'd much rather look at Jesus' ministry metaphorically. He took people that were dead and made them alive. What makes them alive? The bread of life. Man cannot live by bread alone, right? What raises people from the dead? They're in their animal basics instinct. They were succumbing to Satan, which is the insistent self, and then they're raised from the dead and they see Jesus as the light of the world, right? Like the resurrection, all of these things, walking on water, the changing water into wine, something that you drink just to get you by, he changes it into something miraculous and fruity and ancient and wonderful and delightful to the tongue, and makes life like turning water from wine. It's a great metaphor. Did he actually turn vats of water into wine? Maybe he did. I don't know. I wasn't there. Maybe he did a little bit and then people wrote about it. But from a Baha'i perspective, I get to look at a lot of this stuff on a metaphorical and symbolic level. I mean, he starts the whole book of Matthew talking about how he teaches in symbols and in allegories. And he keeps saying, like, people come to me, Jesus, why do you keep talking in allegories? Why do you keep talking in allegories? Like, this is how I teach. But then so many Christians conveniently ignore the allegories that are inherent in the Bible. Is that going to piss a lot of Christians off?
It might. I think at the end of the day, I think that, without getting too much in the weeds, and the theme of the conversation is these things matter. Like this pursuit matters.
Yes.
Like this spiritual pursuit
Amen.
matters. And
that's what it's all about.
And everybody needs to go on that path.
Yes.
And they're going to get in that path, and at the end of that path, and make a determination of what they feel and what they think. And so, there are some really key ideas, like just closing this out, I think, what I would probably call like spiritual acknowledgments. And for me, I think there's like two keys as a starting point for a listener in this conversation. One, which is the need for something greater to yourself that protects against acting in self-interest, which is for many people acknowledgement of a higher power. If you were to ask Dr. Arthur Brooks, who we've both had on the podcast, he talks about the science of happiness, and he talks about the role of the importance of that in the pursuit of a happy life. So that would be one. And then number two, I would say acknowledging that this world isn't all that there is. And so, just those two things, how foundational do you feel like they are and important?
I would say those are right on the money. Mm-hmm. I love that way of thinking. I'm 100% on board. I would say keep going, because I think there are more, but that's a great way to start. I don't know if you're writing a book, but that's a great place to start your book, is with those two seminal ideas about what it means if we are, like Father Teilhard de Chardin said, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. If we are spiritual beings having a human experience, what does that mean?
Yeah.
How does that resonate? But I love what you said, that SoulBoom, and that's why I was so drawn to come on your podcast too. There's some people out there, even Alex O'Connor in his way, who we both adore, are promoting these conversations about what it means to be a human being. We're here for such a short time. Tomorrow it could be you and me keeling over in a parking lot with an aneurysm or a heart attack. It's like this, like my last days. So just do the work, dig deeper, make some decisions, ask for help, beseech, ask for help. Thanks. Wow.
Yeah.
As Anne Lamott would say. And, I love what you're doing on the podcast. And this is my absolute favorite thing to do, is to have this kind of conversation.
Yeah. Well, your story is incredible. I think you're incredible as a human being, and I just admire everything that you've done with your life, and being in film and Hollywood, and choosing to live your life this way and talk about these things is just so incredibly meaningful. And in many ways, you probably feel like you're just getting started. And so I feel like, I just a big fan. So
I appreciate it. You're very kind. And I just have to come up with what the meaning of life is, because I've got to write a book on it.
Yeah. Looking forward to the next book.
Oh, dear Lord.
So thank you.
Thanks.